Hi there and welcome to the interactive session here in Australia. My name is Sarah Oliver. I'm a journalism student at RMIT in Melbourne, and I'm joined here today by Brett McLeod, who is a Channel 9 journalist. Hi Brett, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be here.
That's good. Brett, do you want to tell the audience a little bit about who you are and your career as a journalist?
Sure, I'm a journalist and presenter at the Nine Network, a commercial television network that's right across Australia. I cover a lot of local news mainly. I don't have a particular round, but over the years, I started as a journalist in the same institute where you are, Sarah. Had a lot of experience in radio, particularly talk radio, then moved into television. I was a Europe correspondent for Nine for several years, in the early 2000s. Covered some major stories such as I've been to the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Boxing Day tsunami in Southeast Asia, and now spending a lot more time behind the desk reading news.
Great, thanks Brett. So we just heard from a couple of really great panels. We started out in New Zealand where a panel of experts discussed reporting on terrorism and conflict. In 2009, we all watched on in horror as the terrorist attack happened in New Zealand. The major outlets decided to come together and create a set of guidelines when reporting on this story. So, Brett, you have seen firsthand what it's like reporting on conflict. From what you've seen, what are the risks when covering terrorism and conflicts?
I mean, as a journalist, there's the immediate physical risk, which is not what we're here to talk about, but as we heard from a former hostage himself a short time ago, it is something all journalists have to be aware of. There's no point going to report on a story if you're physically incapacitated from doing that. But there's many other risks, whether it comes from your choice of what vision to show, whether you are inflicting more terror on the audience. I think that particularly came around after 9/11. That really reshaped how many media organisations had to think about coverage, because we all saw the planes going live on television. But then there was a question of how much we replayed that vision. And there was one series of events where television in particular had to make some choices. And that was when people started literally throwing themselves from the Twin Towers. Now, as it was happening live, that vision was shown. But I know here in our network, and I think right across Australia, a decision was made soon afterwards to not show that again, because that was, to most people, the most upsetting vision. So that's something that we have to think about, whether we really re-traumatise people by showing vision that's too explicit. Came up again in New Zealand. I know there was that discussion too when with the Christchurch massacre, because it was streamed live. Do you show any of it? Do you show a portion of it? I don't think any reasonable person would show all of it. But at what point do you stop showing that vision? And I think there's some very pointed arguments to be had in either way there. The other thing is too, how much do we concentrate on the person carrying out the terrorist act and their motivations? Do we, in trying to explain their motivations, give them too much airtime for their cause, which really may be simply continuing the propaganda that they're trying to push out there? So I think those are some of the considerations.
Absolutely. The French journalist in the panel, Didier Laris, brought up the point that if we as the media don't cover terrorism, the story will still be spread around the internet and potentially cause some misinformation and disinformation, which then unfortunately turns the blame back onto the media. So what do you think, what level of responsibility does the media have when covering terrorism?
A high level of responsibility, and it's one where there's not always the black and white answers that we'd like. And I agree that if we just said, look, if we don't give the terrorists the oxygen they want, they won't carry out these acts. It'd be foolish. Ever since the internet came along, anyone can self-publish, anyone can put out information, and particularly misinformation. So we have an obligation to report on major events because they affect people's lives. That's number one. But number two is making choices about how you cover it is not necessarily easy. Now, the classic case in New Zealand was when there was, as we heard from our earlier speakers, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, saying she would not say the name of the person who carried out the attack. And from a personal and perhaps political point of view, I completely understand that. From a journalistic point of view, we don't have a choice. The man committed an atrocious but still criminal act. Like any other criminal, we have to say their name unless there's some legal reason decided by the courts that we can't. But I think we have an obligation to do it. And I think we also have an obligation to have some understanding of where they're coming from as to whether it was a political act, an act carried out in the name of some sort of faith, or whether it's simply a very damaged human being, or all three. And there's no reason it couldn't be all three. But I think there's an obligation to try to find out why they carried it out, what did they see as the motivation, to try to further understand whether other people would carry out attacks in the same name.
I also found it interesting in the panel discussion how different each country reacted to these different types of terrorist attacks. You know, in New Zealand, the public, they talked about how the public were quite upset when the media spoke the name of the terrorist. But in France, it's a completely, different story. I wonder how much the public also has to do with this, with how we report on terrorism.
Well, it's a two-way street now. It never was before. We would broadcast our stories and never get much in the way of feedback. Now, of course, people can contact us immediately and let their opinions be known, and they do. And that is not necessarily a bad thing when it's done in a constructive way. But over the years, I've dealt with many people, far too many people who were victims of either terror or other forms of severe trauma. And I can think of instances here in Australia where we've had mass killings by gunmen. And in each case, the survivors and their families of the victims won't say the name of the person who carried out the attacks. And I fully understand that. As a journalist, we have a responsibility to respect that when we're interviewing them. But again, we still have a greater responsibility to the audience. So that if we are talking about, say, the Port Arthur massacre here in the 90s, where 35 people were killed by one person, the families now, to this day, will still not name the killer. But if I'm doing a report and it's necessary to, I will name him because he is part of the criminal justice system. He's still in prison, and there will be debates about whether his condition, whether he should ever be released, that sort of thing. So I think the public deserves to know the name of that man, and we shouldn't really be hiding it.
Absolutely. I'll just take this opportunity to let anyone watching now that you can submit some questions if you're in the Zoom call or I believe on Facebook, as well as using the hashtag Constructive Conference on Twitter. Brett, my next question for you is, unfortunately at times we've seen how the media coverage of terrorism can cause a ripple effect of other attacks. So how can the media avoid becoming a useful tool for terrorists?
It's a really good question. I don't know if there's a really good answer. I'm not sure we can actually avoid it. By simply reporting on attacks, there is the danger that they're seen as encouraging others, or at least giving other people ideas. And perhaps the most pertinent example is right here in Melbourne, where we had a man who drove down the centre of the city in Burke Street and killed 6 people. Now, that was not a terrorist act, but there was a similar attack the following year. There was a man carrying out a terrorist-based act, and a person was killed. We have to be cognizant of the fact that if we do report on these things, it may give ideas to others. But I'm not sure the media can necessarily be blamed for that. I think if we tried to overly sensationalise it, if our interest was merely, well, these are exciting pictures, so let's just run them over and over again, we could cop some blame for that. But if we're reporting again on a major crime that's had a massive impact on this city, and there's been lots of other vehicle-borne attacks around the world, I don't see how we avoid reporting on those without the danger of giving people ideas. Perhaps those people would carry out an attack another way. They just see this as simply one manifestation of that attack. But if we do report on a truck attack in Nice, and sometime later there's a car-borne attack in Melbourne, still ultimately think that is the fault of the people who are behind the wheel, not the media.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you there. Lastly, Thomas Heghammer said that he's not sure that the guidelines that New Zealand used when covering the massacre actually worked, because we did see some cases after the fact that were directly linked. Do you think that the media should still commit to a code of conduct when covering terrorism?
Oh, well, yes, but I think it's the same code of conduct which should apply to any story where there's been trauma. And I get back to some basic principles, which is to do it ethically and responsibly when it comes to dealing with the victims. Also, to really think hard about broadcasting images. And if it's being streamed live, say on social media, I can only talk about broadcast media and our decisions then on what is available. Because the media's always had more images available than we could ever use. You know, we have filmed things that you would never put to air because they're simply too horrifying. Those choices have always been made. I guess we're just faced with them more frequently now. So that's where I think you can have a code and say, no, we should report this responsibly. The most important thing I think after that is, it should go without saying, is to be as factually correct as we can. I went to the Atocha train station bombings in Madrid, where 200 people were killed, and I was doing a radio cross, and it was the day afterwards, and I was being berated for not blaming it on Al-Qaeda. But in fact, no one had claimed responsibility. So I said, well, if you know who caused it, perhaps you should contact the authorities, because I have no idea who caused it. It did hallmarks an Al-Qaeda attack, but it had no one had claimed responsibility at that point. So the journalist has to take that responsibility of not being used in some sort of culture war on who's responsible, but simply reporting what we can know based on what authorities or those who are in the know can tell them.
Yeah. Well, Brett, is there anything else that you wanted to add about reporting on terrorism?
Only that sadly, I think it is something we're going to be faced with for a long time to come. And it's a good conversation for newsrooms, not just individual journalists, but newsrooms themselves to think about. If there is another Christchurch, God forbid, if there is another Christchurch, to really have a good think about how they cover it and what choices they'd have to make.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we might move on to the second panel that we saw today, which was a discussion about the toxic cycle between the media and politics, especially here in Australia. It's been a somewhat fraught relationship for quite some time now, and the panel discussed how political reporting could use a more constructive angle to help resolve the issue. One of the examples discussed during the panel was about the backlash that a lot of journalists face in the last few months here in Victoria, where we saw one of the toughest lockdowns in the world, and our Premier, Daniel Andrews, had a daily media conference for the first time. More and more people were watching it as it was streamed live, and a lot of people saw how journalists asked the tough questions, and they saw a lot of backlash for that. So going on from this backlash from the public, what are the consequences of this toxic cycle between media and politics?
So many issues there. I mean, I think we have always had a conflict-based relationship with politicians, in that they want to get their story across through the media, and they'd rather the media didn't intrude on them spreading whatever they want to say. So the media's role is to hold politicians to account. And it becomes particularly fraught during a pandemic, during a time when Victoria, for those who are watching and don't know, Australia was very successful as a nation in defeating the first wave of the pandemic. But around the middle of the year, Victoria alone started to experience the second wave, and particularly the city we're in, Melbourne. So as a consequence of that, the city itself, around 5 million people, faced very harsh restrictions. And the government faced a lot of scrutiny because it was apparent that the second wave had been started in hotel quarantine, incoming passengers who weren't being properly secured. So that led to a really fraught time, in that the Premier, Daniel Andrews, held a news conference every day for over 100 days, and would continue the news conference until all questions had been exhausted, which is very unusual for politicians, and to his credit that he kept going. The trouble was, there were a lot of questions that were being asked that he wouldn't give an answer to, at least not answers that most of the media found satisfactory. But to a lot of people watching at home, who perhaps more likely to support what the Premier was doing, they got increasingly frustrated from the media asking what they felt were impertinent questions, or questions that he would say, I've already answered, but in fact he hadn't given a clear answer. Just because a politician says something doesn't mean they're actually answering the question. So there was increasing backlash online. A lot of journalists were getting live comments coming through as people are sitting at home in lockdown, almost obsessively watching these press conferences, getting critiques which went beyond criticism to abuse, lots of personal abuse from both sides. those who said we were going too harsh on the Premier, those who said we weren't going harshly enough. And I have to say, just from my observation, it was the female journalists who got most of the more offensive, in fact, quite disgusting criticism that had nothing to do with the quality of the questions being asked. And so I think a lot of people, I know a lot of journalists really struggled with that. Some went off social media altogether. And I think at that point, it was necessary to do that. It was a time when social media wasn't helping the discussion. It was just an outlet for a lot of anger. And that's something I encouraged other journalists to do, to say, you need to step away from that and just stick to the story. We have to hold governments to account, even if at times we get backlash for it.
Absolutely. You mentioned holding the government to account. Catherine Murphy during the panel talked about how the media is not a consensus builder, and that she feels that a lot of the public have forgotten that the role of journalists is to hold power to account. So how does this toxic relationship affect the role of journalists?
And I should point out too, that Catherine Murphy just named Australian Journalist of the Year by the National Press Club, and you could probably see why by watching that great discussion. We're not here to simply transmit propaganda for the government, though that is part of the job. We're not here just to shout at the government, though that is part of the job. Well, I don't mean shout. I mean say, well, but why? You know, I think one of the best questions any journalist can ask a politician is, but why? And sometimes they get annoyed about that question. But we can never escape that. And we can never not choose to hold people to account because it'll be uncomfortable. Some people, I think, more than others, enjoy the jousting between media and politicians. That can get a bit tedious and doesn't necessarily lead to better questions. But there is a lot to be said for, news conferences. Sometimes we ask the same question over and over, which gets very frustrating to politicians, gets very frustrating to people who might be watching live at home. It does sometimes make the point, though, that they're not directly answering the question. So a non-answer would be illustrative as well. It would be ideal if we were here to just facilitate to make the world a better place. But as Catherine Murphy said, it's actually not a job to make the world a better place. There are others who do that. Our job is to make the world more understandable, and that's a pretty vital role.
Absolutely. Sorry, did we have a question?
Yeah, we have a question in the chat. Question. One of the key points made during the panel is that it's not the media's role to grow consensus, like you just talked about. The commenter agrees with that. However, do we sometimes fall into the trap of growing consensus because this is the more sexy story and also easier to write? I'm not referring to Dan Andrews here, just more generally.
It's a good question. Let's steer into someone who thrived on lack of consensus in the outgoing US president, who was, he knew that Donald Trump knows that if you want to get attention, you create division. And that was his way of often changing headlines. And it was, I think there was a lot of serious discussion amongst serious US media about, are they falling into a trap that every time a major story comes up involving some crisis involving Donald Trump, he could simply change the narrative via a tweet. And so that became a real problem because he's the US president, the most powerful man in the world. So I think we have to, again, measure the value of a story based on more than just the loudest voices and the shoutiest voices.
Absolutely. Let's move on to maybe some ways that we can resolve this issue. Mark Riley and Shalala Medora both spoke about the importance of taking politics out of the hands of politicians. I really like that quote, actually. So what are some other ways that journalists can take the first step towards resolving the toxic cycle?
But the most important thing we can ever do is to report accurately and fairly. It's easier said than done because what's fair is, in the eyes of some people, not unfair in the eyes of others. But accurately is predominant. And we have this new phrase which Kellyanne Conway gave us called alternative facts. And we live in a world where it's considered okay for opinions to be facts. And of course it's not. And we can't. I don't think any serious journalist would fall into that trap. But we must make sure that we have verifiable facts and that whenever we put out information, that we don't simply regurgitate what's given to us from whether it's the government or the opposition or any other authority figure, that we have as best as we can tried to back that up. So I think there is always going to be some conflict, though. I don't think it's ever going to be the happy world where the media and politicians work hand in hand, and nor should they. Otherwise, what is that point in being there? It would simply be a propaganda arm of any government or any political party. And sometimes too, you know, when we talk about being constructive as journalists, that does mean raising uncomfortable and sometimes very uncomfortable issues. We've had some major stories come through here in Australia very recently about war crimes allegedly committed by Australian troops in Afghanistan. Really powerful stories, incredibly well researched, deep dives, long form journalism, and has had a huge impact here in Australia, a huge national impact, a lot of backlash as well. That is a really dark, difficult story. I think it's constructive because it's unearthing something that wouldn't have come out otherwise, and perhaps will lead to a cultural change that's really important. So I think when it comes to being constructive, it doesn't always necessarily mean it's going to be happy, but it is going to be important.
Absolutely. I've just got one last question here for you, Brett. I think there's a lot to say about how a relationship really does go both ways. So with this relationship between the media and politicians or politics, what responsibility does the media have to help resolve this conflict?
I think I can only get back to the point of being accurate. Being fair in terms of reporting as many voices as possible. So you simply don't give one particular party, don't just give their line. You do always offer the alternative point of view as much as you can. It's important not to fall into the trap of both siderism. That's simply, they said this, they said that, therefore that's the end of the reporting I have to do. There is room for some analysis and also some weight given to those who seem more credible than others. We have to consider that. In fact, particularly more so now than any other time I've seen. So I think really our duty is not to the politicians. Our duty is to the audience and to the people that read us, listen to us and see us, to make sure that we're getting the most accurate and fair representation of the story that we can. And sometimes that'll mean we report on things that we don't like reporting on, as in we might have to write very critical pieces about people that we like. And I've done that many times. And I think there's a misunderstanding that if we like a particular politician or even a particular political party, that we're going to give them a fair run. Some might do that, but I think all of us have been in that situation where we think, I really like this person, but this story, I'm going to have to write this story and be completely blunt in the assessment of what they've done, because what they've done is wrong. And that is our role. One of the greatest journalists I've ever worked with, Laurie Oakes, who was a doyen in Canberra for many years, said, journalists cannot afford to be friends with politicians. And that's why.